Right, I thought I would start with a brief background for Norwich's smallest houses. So if we move on, next picture. Norwich still reflects the Norman framework, which was imposed on it in the 11th and 12th century. The Normans built a royal castle and a priory, and they created a French borough around the new marketplace, which is still there at the heart of the city. And these obliterated much of Saxon Norwich. And you can see the sort of the line across Norwich, which is the striped line, which is the Norman Norwich on the map. Later, other religious orders, including the Dominicans or Blackfriars, moved into Norwich. And at the Reformation, the city bought up the site of the Blackfriars, now St Andrew's Hall, which is on the top right picture, which is the most complete standing priory building and is still in use. In the 14th century, the city invested heavily in its infrastructure, including city walls. It bought up the castle fee and built staithes and wharfs. In 1404, Norwich achieved the right to self-government through a mayor and an alderman. And the Guildhall on the bottom right here was built in 1407 to 1412. It's a fine flint building, which served as a centre of government until the new City Hall was built in the 1930s. Next slide, please. Okay. All right. The city authorities also controlled trade and economy. This included a textile trade with a cloth hall for the control and the quality of and prices, and the trade in local agricultural produce. And it was the merchants in the distributive trades who became the most wealthy and powerful citizens. And they built themselves some very fine residences, which you'll hear more about from Chris King. The city owned and let out the market stalls and shops, and a detail of the 1541 sanctuary map in the centre shows the area of the marketplace with two-storey market stalls and shops. And around the marketplace, then and now, is St Peter Mancroft, the main parish church of the city, and the Guildhall, which is at the bottom of that sanctuary map in grey. And number 36, Marketplace, now a pub, this is just here, a pub known as the Cigar at Wolsey. It's a 3-4-storey building. Robert Smith, in his 1990 examination of the pre-1700 buildings in Norwich, suggested that it may have served a city or market function. And close to the Guildhall was what was the Common Inn, owned by the city for stranger merchants to stay. And these are the pictures on the left-hand side. It's from the 16th century with some 17th rearrange. The 3 stories with jetties and timber-framed first and second stories. It was restored after being damaged in the air raids in 1942. And Plunkett's photograph is from, which is below, is from 1939, before the air raid. So you could see that they did a reasonable job of restoration. George Plunkett's collection of photographs from the 1930s is a great source of information about Norwich buildings and highly recommended by the likes of me and anybody else. And that's his website details at the bottom. Okay, so looking at Norwich's smaller houses, and I thought I'd start by looking at houses sort of roughly between 1500 and 1650. It's hard to date any of the smaller standing houses in Norwich to before about 1507, when Norwich experienced a series of major fires. They destroyed perhaps something like 40% of the housing stock. But we do have information about earlier houses from archaeological excavations and documentary records. So we're looking here at Elm Hill, one of the few standing buildings to have survived the fires. There's a stack, I was talking about it, but there's a stack which is kind of interesting between two rooms on each of its 3 floors. So there are 2 heated rooms on each floor. And there's an external stair turret against the rear wall. And the houses around number 9 are all thought to date to after the fire. So what did Norwich's small houses look like? And what are their key features? On the right here is a picture from the Almshouse excavations north of the River Wensum and the Coalgate. They reveal the remains of many small houses. And this illustration shows how the excavators think the area may have looked in 1520. With the 2-storey houses, flint, rubble ground floors, tiled roofs, chimneys, and fireplaces. Now, looking first at height, Norwich had very few tall buildings compared with other cities. The city walls were 2.5 miles long and enclosed an area larger than the City of London. This meant there was less pressure on space. We've seen some 3-storey buildings already. There's 9 Elm Hill here and the 2 in the marketplace. They're all corner sites and probably religious, as here, or civic, as in the marketplace. Another standing 3-storey building is number 21 Lower Gate Lane. It's a late timber-framed building with a jetty on the north and the west at 1st and 2nd floor levels. The floors are supported on an unusual arrangement of ceiling beams, so there's no dragon post. It's a single cell building, but it's on a prime street corner site on the road leading up to the market and very close to what was the Seld or the Cloth Hall. Next slide, please. However, the majority of Norwich's small houses are 2-storey, and this is the case both in the city and in the Cathedral Close. So some examples, I'll go fairly quickly through these. This first one here is number 15 Bedford Street, and it's one of the earliest surviving non-elite buildings in Norwich from the late 15th or early 16th century. It's been very well researched by both Robert Smith in his 1990 thesis and Jane Rimmer in her 2007 thesis, who have plans, photographs and drawings. So just a very brief review of this building here. On the top left shows the building in its street setting. It was 2-storey, it was heightened in the 18th century. And to the right, that's the green building, is number 19 to 21 Bedford Street, an extensive mercantile property. And there's no evidence of chimney stacks. It had a timber-framed upper story, and the shop has a central door with 2 openings on either side, and round the doors and the jambs of the door of the shop, there's mortises, probably for a fixed display bench beneath the windows. Smith, in his 1990 thesis, considers that the jetty has been truncated, as you could see on the picture on the bottom right, and that the building was probably extended further. He suggests both to the east, to what is number 17, and also probably to the west. Right, next slide, please. Right, a brief glimpse of other 2-storey buildings to give you a sense of them. So there's 8 to 10 Charing Cross at the top left, which is in front of Strangers' Hall. And others around the city. The one on the bottom right, the Madder Market ones, the ones that was a single width of which was enlarged to a 2-room width in the 17th century and re-roofed. And next slide, please. There's other 2-storey houses further away from the marketplace. The one on the top left here, 25 to 27 St George's Street, is one that Chris King considers in some detail, and it's worth reading up what he has to say. The one on the bottom left, number 28 Benedict Street, is one that you've just seen in Andrea's talk when she talks about some of the painting inside that fairly modest little building, which is now Sound Clash in good Ukrainian colours. And number 8 on the right, number 8 Tombland on the right, the bottom right there, is one of the few standing buildings with the gable facing the street. It's on the edge, right on the edge of St George Tombland churchyard. And was it we're talking about stalls. Was it a stall at some point set up by the church? And again, it's another building which both Robert Smith and Chris King have had a look at and have got masses of information about it. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Okay, and there's some overlap here between, I think, the things that Tom Williamson was talking about earlier. Because of the shortage of good local building stone, flint's the main stone used in Norwich. You get it used all the way down the line from the priory and the churches in the larger and in the smaller houses. And flint and lime for the mortar were quarried in the south of Norwich. This particular row of houses, the only row of houses like this in Norwich, number 2 to 12 Gildencroft, is a small row of houses north of the Wensum and well away from the centre of the city on the south side of St Guston's churchyard. I'm giving you a map there to see give you a sense of just how much it's outside the city area. The row's divided into 6 cottages, each of 2 bays. It's got a flint and rubble ground floor, and the first floor is timber framed and jetted to the front. The bottom left picture shows a bit of work at the back. It's not jetted there. The position of the stairs may have allowed for the separate entrances and tenancies on the ground and the first floor of this row. Now, Jane Rimmer studied this row in great depth, and Chris King has plans of the rooms, which are well worth having a look at. Okay, next slide. Some more flint. 2 examples here. On the left-hand side, 86 to 89 King Street. And you can see, I've included Plunkett's photograph at the top there because he gives a good view of the brick gable wall at the side here. And the other illustration I've given on the right-hand side is 32 to 36 Elm Street. And I chose this one partly, it's a huge, great house. It's been divided into 2 since, but it's one of the few houses that you see with worked stone, with worked flint. These houses here are revealing their flint, but many of the houses were rendered and painted, so it's not easy on photographs to see what material was being used. Norwich does have some fine flint work, as I've shown in the Guildhall, but also on some of the elite merchants' houses. And I've given you just there so you don't go away from Norwich thinking that we don't have good flint work, of an example from the Guildhall. Okay, next slide, please. Now, Norwich does not have splendid timber-framed houses. Very interesting to hear what Tom was saying about the use of wood in vernacular buildings. Wood was used mainly for jetties, upper stories, windows, and for roofs. So some examples here of the use of wood. The top left is, you can see, number 22 to 26 Princess Street. It's a 16th century house with timber framed first floors, now divided into 3 properties. And And on the right, you can see number 20, Princess Street. It's got taller first floor rooms, and it's got a jetties going back into a back range as well. Here, in these examples, as in Norwich generally, the upper stories are close studded and there are no visible arch braces. There's examples, nice examples of quality woodwork in doorways and yard entrances, as those two examples at the bottom suggest. And inside the smaller houses, and Chris King talks about this very effectively, I think, there is woodwork which suggests that money and care were invested in details such as moulded ceilings, and as Andrea suggested, even painting those. Next slide. Excavations documentary records also contribute to our knowledge of small houses. So, for instance, Jane Miller reports that in the 15th century there were many clay houses which were built of clay, sort of packed around vertical timber studs which carried a wall plate to support a roof structure, very much like, I think, the example that Atkins gives in his article in 1991. And certainly excavations suggest there were fewer clay walls and more flint and rubber walls by the end of the 15th century and into the 16th century. And Rimmer also reports that the great hospital was building houses with chimneys in the 15th century. And the sanctuary map, for instance, and I've got you a little detail of it in the middle, shows chimneys in what is King Street and north of the Wensum. North is the south of this map. Next slide. Undercrofts are an important feature of Norwich houses. As you realise, if we were walking around the city now, Norwich is not flat. The River Wensum cuts through substantial escarpments, and Smith's map on the left shows the position of Undercrofts known about in 1990, and others have been discovered since. Terry George has a wonderful Facebook page and a YouTube video which explores many of Norwich's Undercrofts. Some of the early Undercrofts were in stone and high quality, but the majority, however, are built in brick. And some of these, as the middle ones suggest, are impressive. But usually they're modest structures with one or two side chambers. Some were barrel vaulted, some rib vaulted, and several had columns. And there's some plans of those from Smith's article in Vernacular Archaeology and Architecture in 1983. Unlike many other cities, the Undercrofts are entered from within the building rather than from the road. So they're linked to commercial or domestic functions. And they're very much a 14th and 15th century feature. They don't seem to be built after the middle of the 16th century. Undercrofts often survived the fires which burnt the houses above them. So two examples where the building and the Undercroft are thought to be contemporary are 9 Elms Hill, which we've seen, and at the bottom right here, with nice photograph by George Plunkett of 13 to 17 St Giles Street. Now, over the course of the 17th, let's go on to the next slide, sorry. Over the course of the 17th century, there were changes to these smaller houses. So we get the use of full height use of flint and brick. So we move away from the flint and brick first ground floors and timber first floors to this full height flint and brick walls. You've got some there from King Street at the top, and a nice one of Plunkett's, which shows that many of those houses have been destroyed since the 1930s. And below St. Benet's, for instance, where both the front and the rear range are built totally in brick and flint. Next slide. We're getting increased heights and we're getting attics and dormers. I've shown a couple of adding stories being added at the top, and at the bottom you can see some nice evidence of where buildings have been heightened. Let's have the next picture. And we do dormers. A wonderful selection of dormers in Norwich. I think one of the great treats of Norwich. We've even got a double height dormer on Tombstone there, and that flat's for sale if anybody's interested. They come singly and in combinations. Next slide, please. We've already seen some examples of rear ranges to seek frontages, and at, for instance, at 20 Princess Street and the Plough at St. Benedict Street. But here we've got a 17th century example at 56 to 60 King Street. So that it's on the ground floor, you've got a pub on what was a pub on the left-hand side, which gives it the name, the 3 Tons Yard. Moulder string course, and this the top 8 curving gables with a central Dutch gable there with a dormer window. Those gables were rebuilt in the 19th century, but it's thought that they probably represent the original build. And there's a carriageway on the left of the building here, and then through that entrance you can see the examples of these rear ranges. They've been tidied up and had work done to them, the ones at the 3 Tons Yard, but on the other side you can see on the bottom right there into Swan's Yard, get a better sense of the density of the occupation in the buildings in those areas, and even a stepped gable there. Next slide. The other thing we find in the 17th century is an increase in smaller houses and in the subdivisions of houses. So 2 examples of 17th century smaller houses here are numbers 1 and 2, Tombland Alley on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, number 61 to 63 St. George's Street, another small house, but in a poorer part of the city. And there's Smith's plan there, and to give you a sort of sense of what his take on those two, there are 2 views of that same house. Now, some of these smaller buildings were probably workshops or shops, as well as domestic space. And as at Gildencroft, for instance, there might well have been sort of areas which were separately rented out. Okay, next slide. Now, one of the reasons that it's thought for the shift to smaller houses is that there was the population and population increase in Norwich. And I've taken 2 more pictures from the Arms Lane excavations. The site on the left is as they think of it in the 1650s, and then again in about 1720, where it's getting more crowded. And what they're picking up on the excavations there is that what started as a larger house seems to be decreased in size, and so doors that would have led from one room to another get to be blocked. And And certainly the increase in the population is associated, as Pound is suggesting, with poverty. His study of the Norwich 1570 census of the poor and the hearth tax data suggests that Norwich had a greater proportion of poor people than was the case in many cities. Okay, let's move on to the next one. And then I thought I was going to talk about the houses in the Cathedral Close at the same time as those in the city, but there are some ways in which they're very distinctive. So I thought probably to kind of do it separately. So Norwich was an important religious centre with the priory and lots of other religious houses. In fact, the plan on the left from Barnett's book sort of gives you a sense of just how much of the city was taken up with some of those religious houses. In 1538, the priory was transformed into a community of secular priests, and the priory church became the cathedral. Now, in the Cathedral Close, there were some small houses. There were also some fairly large and magnificent houses, but the smaller houses tend to be, and I've messed around with the Gildencroft's plan here to put a green line on so you can see that the smaller houses tend to cluster down that end of the Cathedral Close. But let's have the next slide. But I thought with one that isn't down that end of the Cathedral Close, number 69. And 69 is a very curious house, I think. It was built in 1549, so about 10 years after the priory became a secular cathedral. And it's in a very conspicuous place. It's next to the Cartonnary Chapel, and it's very close to the west front of the cathedral. But it looks as if it's a house that could pass muster in the city. It's flint and rubble ground floor. It's got the jetty and the close studded upper floor. But it's the only house in the Cathedral Close that uses that method of construction. And so I think that makes it a kind of a curious one. It acquires its Dutch gable later. I'll come back to that perhaps later. And another little house, which I rather like, is 59, the sacrist's house in the Cathedral Close, which was, the sacrist was one of the lesser officers of the priory. And it's tucked away behind the Cathedral Close. It's thought to be 16th century with some later alterations. Next slide. And there are some smaller houses along Ferry Lane. At the top one, number 30, I put Plunkett's picture in because he's got less foliage than is the case now. The close come much greener and you can't see the house nearly so well. But you can see that too is it's got flint and brick wall on it. At the left is a 19th century addition to that house, and below we've got two houses, 27 and 28. Number 27 in pink is 17th century two-story stucco flint house, and Roberta Gilchrist suggested it might have been a single-storied medieval building with that off-centre door, heightened and given its dormers in the 17th century. And the number 8, the blue one, kind of fits around the gables. Next slide. And there are also small houses on Hook Walk. I've given it two examples at one end of Hook Walk. I like the one on the right, number 40. They were obviously doing something for the war when I was there on one occasion, so you can get a good sense of how that wall is constructed. Number 37 to 38 has got amazing kind of diaper work and has a date there a date stone of 1633 on it. And below is number 49, two views of it, which is the gardener's exchequer, again, one of the smaller houses, which got rebuilt and messed around with all over the years. But these houses, I think, they're two-storey, as in the city, but they're built to full height in flint and brick. And there is some thought that the dormers are probably earlier than you see them in the city. Next slide. The Commonwealth and Civil War was a difficult time for the Close, but after 1660, the restoration of the monarchy, you find the Close and the Cathedral getting back on its feet. But it's the nature of the Close changes because there are fewer clergy. Those who are around tend to let their houses out to lay people. And the chapter itself was busy building houses that would attract lay people in as a way of dealing with its finances. And so after 1660, you can see lots of brick and flint being used, but also reused stone from the monastic buildings that have been pulled down and the stones being reused. I think the number 56 in the bottom right there is interesting because that again is the house that Andrea looked at the wall paintings, and you can see one half of it, the right-hand side, built in the 16th century, and then the left-hand side built in the 17th century, using much of that stonework. Next slide. Now there are some bigger houses in the Close being built, and I think the one on the bottom left, I'm just very brief, is interesting because it looks so different from the things that we've seen and will see in the city. It looks very symmetrical, and there are very few houses like that in the city. So next slide. I thought I'd finish with number 14 and number 16, Tombland. So the only house in the city really which has that sense of symmetry and the sort of thing that was happening in the 17th century in the Close, that is in the city. It's very close to the Erpington Gate, but next to it is its neighbour, number 14, Tombland, which is a kind of an intriguing place, I think. It starts life off in the first half of the 16th century with a gable facing Tombland and a jetty running down the south side on the South Range. And this gets extended, as Robert Smith's plans show. It gets extended, the hall goes, it gets staircases in it, it gets those, a staircase in it, and it gets those 4 chimneys, and it gets heightened. So a lot of work happens in that house in the 17th century, but it is not made to look like some of these other houses, unlike its neighbour at number 16. It retains its traditional Norwich appearance in spite of its proximity to all those other examples of changing building traditions. Okay, last and final slide. So I hope you enjoyed this virtual tour of some Norwich houses, and they're even better on a trip around this very fine city. Thank you.